Hey folks, and welcome to Typology, the show in which we explore the mystery of the human personality through the lens of the Enneagram. My name is Anthony Skinner, the producer of the show, and we are thrilled to have you here, and I know you're going to be thrilled about this week's guest. Beatrice Chestnut is back to talk with us about all things Enneagram 9. That's right, B is back. So make sure you tune in. If you know a 9 or you know someone who's in a relationship with a 9 or works with a 9, make sure you get them on this episode. And just a reminder, we recently launched the Typology Institute membership. As a member, you receive a monthly newsletter from Ian, an exclusive podcast episode, and what Ian and I love most about the new membership is the monthly town halls where we get to connect with you, answer your questions about the Enneagram, and grow together as a community. It's really, really special. We just finished one last night and had such a good time. If you haven't signed up yet, visit typologyinstitute.com/membership to learn more and to sign up. The next town hall is June 29th, and we'd love to see you there. Well, hey, it's time to get to Master Enneagram teacher Beatrice Chestnut. So without any further ado, here is your host, Ian Cron.
Beatrice Chestnut, Grande Dame of the Enneagram. Welcome back to Typology. We're glad you're here.
Good to be here.
We've been in this series talking about 1s, 2s, 6s, and 9s. Now, people may be wondering why we picked those four types, you know. In part, it's because sometimes here on Typology, we have difficulty locating 1s, 2s, 6s, and 9s. Here we are in Nashville with 1 million 4s. Publicists for authors and musicians oftentimes contact us but their clients are often 3s, 7s, and 8s, right? They're people who are go-getters, you know. When they see something they want, they either go and ask for it directly or just take it, right? Go get it. So we've had some struggles with 1s, 2s, 6s, and 9s, and that's why I really wanted to focus in on them. But I do hope we circle back at some point and talk about these other types. You know what we should almost do, Anthony?
What's that?
We should think about at some point, with B's permission, in bundling these talks.
Ooh, that's a great idea.
We should do all of those numbers and bundle them and give them away for gratis. You know,
yeah,
like
love
just
that.
Hey, here's a fast download on these types. That could be kind of cool. B, today we're talking about 9s, and I'm excited. As you know, I'm married to a 9. I'm the dad of a 9, and so I'm fascinated by this number. And as I said to you before we started, one of the interesting things about 9s is they appear so uncomplicated, and yet they're very complicated, aren't they?
Yes.
And I'm curious about what you think about this. Just talking about the overall system of the Enneagram. Here we have these people who are perched on the crown of the Enneagram. And I've heard a lot of teaching around this. And I want to just explore with you for a second. What are your thoughts on this idea or this fact that the 9s are perched on the crown? Like, people will ask me all the time, are they the best number because they're way up there? And I'm going, no. However, they are there for a reason. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I've studied Dante's Divine Comedy and the Enneagram. And what's interesting is they're both part of sort of the 7 deadly sins. They're part of the 7, and they're also part of the inner triangle, part of the 3, 3, 6, 9, that's at the kind of part of the core structure of the Enneagram diagram. So they're included in both. And I also think that 9s are the prototype for all of us of some very important aspects of just being human, and especially when we adopt a personality. And that is this tendency to kind of go to sleep to ourselves.
Yes. They're almost the headwaters. That's how I like to think of them. Way up there, perched on the crown. They're the headwaters of that, of falling into this kind of spiritual, emotional torpor that where we walk through the world at half in this sort of half sleep state. And then, of course, when we learn the Enneagram and perhaps some other spiritual or psychological tools, we begin to awaken. That's why when I'm always talking about living in awakened state, right?
Yes.
But here's that 9 up there who, as you said, this archetype of the one who has fallen asleep to themselves, as does every number. but perhaps not with as much. To me, at times, the 9 that's not very self-aware is in a deeper state of sleep. Does that make sense to you?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we all have that where we kind of go to sleep to our experience on some level, whether it's, just the fact that, a large part of us is unconscious. Buddha called it ignorance. And yet I think that's sort of what the 9s do in spades,
Right. And I think this also argues for something I'm going to be doing a live stream on YouTube about, which is the importance of a mindfulness practice for all types. And this is, one of my hills that I stand on and scream from, because the scientific research shows that a regular practice of mindfulness meditation helps us develop that inner witness that can keep us awake, to live in this moment with awareness of what's happening, what's going on inside me. And it gives us the ability, what some call the sacred pause, the ability to move from reactivity to responsiveness, and to say, what is motivating my wanting to say this or to do this? And it's not self-preoccupation and navel-gazing. It's just this little monitor back here that's asking good questions and helping us to pause and live more wisely in the world. So we're going to talk about subtypes in a moment, because both of us are crazy about them. And but let's talk here again, as we've started with in the series with all of them. What can we say about all 9s in common? What kinds of features or hallmark features do they share in common?
Well, I think all 9s share a tendency to be other referencing, or more tuned in to what's going on the outside than they are tuned into what's going on inside them. It's harder to access their internal information about themselves, and just a kind of tendency to focus more on what's going on out there. I also think a tendency to want to create harmony in their environment, and to almost be someone who is harmonizing with the environment in order to help create more a sense of sort of everyone's okay with everyone, and an avoidance of conflict. I think that's a big one for 9s. There's a sensitivity to tension and conflict, and a wanting to prevent that from happening or avoid it.
Yes. And doesn't that speak to this whole idea of fusion or merging, right? Because part of the 9's personality structure is this desire to merge or fuse with another person or a group or with the body in order to avoid, particularly I think with social and one-to-one types, disconnection. Right, with another person, right, particularly the one or the group with whom they've merged, right? And so conflict represents, oh gosh, this could cause even a little disconnection is too scary for me, because who am I apart from gleaning my identity and by merging with the agenda, the viewpoints, the opinions, and the preferences of the other or the group. So that's been my experience of 9s, and I'm not sure if you want to add anything to that, but that's part of the world.
I would say that is the core of it. I would say it's about avoiding separation, and there's this sort of deep program, almost going back to like having to leave the womb, or sort of that comfort of union with the mother. It's almost like, in all of us, we all have that sort of body memory of having to become a separate being. And I think for 9s, there's something threatening and scary and hard about that. And it's almost as if conflict means separation in their mind at the personality level. And there's something that's potentially annihilating about separation, not belonging. And so there's this deep unconscious avoidance of that happening, and all kinds of subtle things that can happen in relationships between people can feel like threatening separation.
Hey everybody, one of the lessons I've learned over the years is that not everybody benefits from a traditional 50-minute counseling session. And this is why some people can go to couples therapy or personal counseling for a long time and never really get anywhere. This is why I'm such a believer of intensive counseling and my friends at Restoring the Soul in Colorado, created by my longtime friend Michael Cusick to help couples or individuals experience deep change in half-day blocks over 1 or 2 weeks. Now listen, if you can't wait months or years to get to the bottom of an issue or to experience breakthrough, you need to get in touch with my friend Michael and his extraordinary team of counselors at Restoring the Soul. If you're looking to get out of the rut you're in, but can't wait months or years, call Restoring the Soul today for a free consultation with Michael's staff. Call 303-932-9777 and learn how their intensive counseling process can help you. As a special bonus, just for Typology listeners, make sure to visit www.restoringthesoul.com/typology to download their PDF called 5 Ways Unaddressed Trauma May Be Derailing Your Relationships. My wife the other day, this will show you how much work she's done and continues to do. She had an interaction with someone that she cares very deeply about, and she had to hold a boundary. And this is not natural for her as a 9, right? Holding a boundary.
Right.
A boundary had been set. This person had pushed against the boundary. This person's a 7. It's very charming, far more aggressive than she is, pushing the boundary. Please make an exception. It's only once, and the 9 is hearing this and, getting pie-eyed, right? And we spoke about it afterwards, and she said she'd get back to them. And I was like, okay, you're wrestling with the boundary here, right? And we talked about it, and I'm like, I ain't busting this boundary. You know what I mean? Like that is the worst thing we could do in this situation. Yes. And eventually she just got quiet. She said, I just don't want the conflict. And I was like, good on you.
That is great work. Yes.
Yeah. And then of course she went and held the boundary. And I said to her, that when you hold the boundary, it has more power than if I do it. Yeah. Right? Because this is a break from the pattern that has been established for a long time in that relationship between you and that person. And early on in our marriage, I would have had to hold the boundary and been the bad guy.
Yeah.
Where you would always be then perceived as the person who was kinder, nicer, more easygoing, right? And that creates a very unhealthy kind of presentation as a couple. Right, and can cause some real conflict between a couple. Right, can cause a lot of conflict. Okay, I would say too about 9s that, as we said earlier, they're self-forgetting. Right, that's part of the falling asleep. There's this. This is going to sound harsh, but I think it's true. 9s who are really lacking self-awareness, who haven't done any work, can go as far as being self-deleting, self-erasing. And that's very sad when a 9 kind of gets to that point when that's their default mode. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like as we talk about subtypes, right? But before we do, I want you to help people understand this, because this is maybe the most common mistype that people come to me about between 9s and 2s. And why don't you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I agree with you. 9s and 2s are one of the biggest lookalikes on the Enneagram, and they do mistype as each other a lot. I would say some differences, of course, the similarities are clear. They're referencing helpful, supportive of others. can lose themselves, hard time saying no. But the differences are that twos are more emotional. Even though twos sometimes repress their feelings habitually, unconsciously, those feelings usually come back up and they can be quite emotional. Cry more often, get angry more often. Most twos will say they also avoid conflict, but they can do it if they need to, or because they do get mad periodically or resentful. It's harder to avoid conflict as much as nines do. I would also say that I think nines are actually one, as you probably remember, one of my pet peeves in the Enneagram world is twos are sort of presented very simplistically as helpers and givers.
Mm-hmm.
I actually think nines are bigger helpers, are better helpers than twos, because twos secretly want something back.
Right.
It's about recognition. It's about appreciation. It's about giving to get. Whereas with nines, they often mean it in a more uncomplicated way. They tend to be more naturally humble. But also, I think twos are more selective when it comes to people in their lives. Nines are more democratic. And there's a way that nines are just emotionally steady. They're more truly easygoing, whereas those twos can be easygoing and sometimes think they're more easygoing than they are. I think they have more ups and downs.
Yes, and I another piece of it that has struck me in my relationship with twos and nines is that twos are far more image conscious than nines.
Yes, of course.
You can even see it in their dress, right?
Yes.
One particular subtype of nines, sometimes if they're not very self-aware, can be kind of frumpy. You know what I mean? like not paying attention to their appearance. And whereas twos, very attuned to appearance. And that's not as much the case with nines, who are, a phrase I use often is, what you see is what you get, people. Another distinction I would make, again, sorry if you've all heard this before, but I always say, if you want someone to lie for you in court, don't ask a nine. You know what I mean? A two could lie for you. A three could lie for you. A seven could lie for you. But a nine, they are crappy liars, because they are those kind of what you see. There's kind of a sweet guilelessness about nines. There's kind of a, I don't know, sort of a natural, maskless sort of part of them, which is lovely, which can be very, very lovely, and that I like. So the passion of the nine is sloth. And again, I think we tend to think of this as physical laziness, but that is too simplistic. And in particular, for one of the subtypes, it is definitely not the case, right? So what is sloth in your mind?
Sloth is, it's more a psycho-spiritual laziness, a laziness with regard to taking action on behalf of oneself.
Right.
So nines can engage in a lot of action, and they're often very hardworking, especially when it comes to other people, supporting others, doing things for the team, the organization, the family. But when it comes to their own personal priorities, their own agenda, their own desires, it can be hard to know what that is, and especially hard to act in service of themselves. And so it's a kind of losing energy, making yourself unimportant when it comes to tuning into yourself, accessing your own interior, and being able to take action on your own behalf. And of course, the virtue is right action, which is the opposite.
Right. And I would say, too, that there's a kind of laziness around self-development. Around investing in the growth of the self. And we'll talk about this in a moment, in the process of what Jung would have called individuation, becoming their own person, finding their own voice, identifying their mission and calling and pursuing it, rather than like a biker in a race drafting off of other bikers. Instead of running their own race. Right. And of course, we're describing nines here who are not very self-aware. These are the struggles that nines have. I remind everybody that every type, we do not single any type out. Everyone is an equal opportunity player here. We all have our stuff, and the Enneagram just reveals it to us in ways that often are uncomfortable, but really, really important to know about. In my experience, they are very practical people. They are concrete people sometimes, meaning that there's less oftentimes self-reflection with this type. I mean, a lot of nines I know don't have I'm a 4, so I have more language. My ability to self-reflect goes on overdrive. I left my therapist yesterday. By the way, I have 2-hour sessions with my therapist. We don't even have 50-minute sessions. I have 2-hour sessions because he asked me, how are you feeling today? An hour goes by before I'm done. You know what I'm saying? And I have used every metaphor and symbol and characters in books. And I saw this movie and this character triggered me. And it's like I'm, in the soup of it. And whereas, a lot of nines are, if you ask them, well, especially about sort of existential things sometimes, they sort of don't know how to answer. The language of the interior world seems to elude them a little bit. Has that been your experience with nines that aren't very self-aware?
I would say yes, and especially the self-preservation 9 is the most practical, the most concrete. They can even feel energetically a little bit 8-ish. And 8s, I think, are also quite concrete.
Yes.
So yes, I totally get what you're saying, and I like the contrast between you and your therapy session and the 9.
My wife hated therapy until she started to do her work. She hated it because she would just go. I would talk the therapist, and I would always try and create space for her to talk. But every time the therapist asked a question before she started doing the work, she just cried. And she would say, I don't know. I just don't know what to tell you about when you ask questions about my interior world. I don't know. And I think that's part of that other referencing, that sort of externalized focus on the world. Okay, let's jump into the 3 different types of nines. We're talking here about the self-pres 9, the social 9, and the one-to-one 9. As we've mentioned in other shows, knowing subtypes is so important. These are 3 nuanced expressions of the type. In each of them, we get a finer set of distinctions of the type, and knowing them. If you're going to make, it's wonderful to know your type. It's great to know your wing. If that's where you choose to end your Enneagram journey, well, you did get something. I mean, you it's not like you got nothing. But man, when you jump into the subtypes, I think you're heading on a path to greater self-awareness, greater self-knowledge, and to doing deeper transformational work. Because as you say, B, the transformational path for each of the subtypes is so different, and it's no one size fits all, right? When we jump in, this is one of the reasons that part of me wishes I could have talked about subtypes in the road back to you, but being a primer, I couldn't make the book that long, and I think for beginning students it was going to be overwhelming to jump into it. So maybe on a future book I'll be able to dive more deeply into subtypes. All right, let's talk about self-preservation 9s. You start.
So self-preservation 9s, so all 9s have a hard time connecting with their own sense of being and the pain connected to not being in touch with their own sense of being.
Yes.
So each of the subtypes represents something they use to distract themselves from their own sense of being. And with self-preservation 9s, what they focus on most is comfort, and the comfort that comes from routines and activities, things that they engage in that sort of help them feel grounded in the world. And it's almost like a little bit of a substitute for kind of a higher sense of being connected to themselves. So it's like looking for what they need in a substitute. Like finding comfort and ease in watching television instead of maybe an activity where they would be more tuned into a deeper part of themselves.
Right.
And it can be different things for different people.
Yeah, it seems to me. Well, let me ask you this. Have you experienced, even sometimes, because we oftentimes talk about sex or food or zoning out on Netflix or whatever, but even exercise can become a form of comfort, right? So it's not necessarily always the appearance of lack of self-discipline or a lack of too much inertia. It can appear very active, but there's comfort in the activity itself.
Right. And it can be reading. I mean, it doesn't have to be something that's obviously, like you're saying, a kind of zoning out, but anything that sort of helps, it's sort of something to focus on that is a comfortable thing for them to do. And it's often there's a routine. One of my best friends is a self-preservation 9, and every day she sits in the same chair and drinks a cup of coffee at the same time and reads the newspaper. And so there's a kind of touching in with herself and finding a sense of comfort and groundedness in her day. That is, you could see that as a positive. However, it's also something where she's a little bit lost to a deeper sense of herself. It's not the same as like mindfulness meditation for an hour.
Right.
So it's a little bit different that way. And I've heard people who have like crossword puzzles that they do all the time that are like that. A good friend of mine is self-preservation 9, loves to read and is always reading. And this is also a subtype that likes to be alone a little bit more than the other 9s. We've talked about how they merge. Self-preservation 9 is the one that would actually finds a lot of comfort kind of doing their own thing. I talked to a 9 the other day and I was trying to help her sort out which subtype she was. And at one point she used the phrase like, yeah, people say I'm in my own little world. Okay, that's a little bit more of the self-preservation 9 because there's not as much. It's the merger with others is not as total. Now, it doesn't mean they still don't merge. It's just that it's like they have one foot out in their own comfortable routines that helps them feel a little bit more separate and a little bit more tuned in to what they feel comfortable doing, which is something that serves their self-preservation need.
Yeah. When I think of it is that spinning on habit, right? That kind of, falling into the allure of the status quo, like not breaking out of the status quo is a way of doing life in your sleep. Like you could just do life in your sleep. It's like, I don't really have to expend a lot of energy thinking about doing something new or expending energy actually doing it. If I just do the same thing over and over again, it's just easy for me to not have to expend energy. Hey, Anthony.
Hey, Ian.
I've been crushing it around the clock on my newest book, right?
I know you have.
Well, part of my process is researching topics related to my content.
Okay.
But as you can imagine, there are tons of resources out there. So let me tell you about one of my ultimate life hacks.
Oh, come on. Please tell us.
Okay. It's called Blinkist.
All right.
If you haven't heard of it, Blinkist takes the best need-to-know content from over 4,000 nonfiction bestsellers and condenses it down into just 15 minutes that you can read or listen to. I like Blinkist, and I'll tell you why. Because it quickly gives me the main points of a book, which helps me evaluate which books I want to make time to read in full later, and which ones to prioritize now for the projects I'm working on at the moment. And since Blinkist works on my phone, my tablet, or a web browser, I use it anywhere, whether I'm traveling, making breakfast, working out, man, you name it.
I like it.
I've listened to, and I really highly recommend, Daniel Nettles' book, Personality, and Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. I love both of them. You can even read or listen to the key takeaways from The Road Back to You by yours truly.
Oh, yeah.
I like that with Blinkist, you get unlimited access to read or listen to a massive library of condensed nonfiction books. All the books you want, and all for just one low price. Yeah. So check this out. They just unveiled their new audio content format called Shortcasts. Now, you can use Blinkist's Shortcasts to quickly catch up on podcast episodes you've missed.
This is amazing.
They present and highlight the key learnings of a podcast episode through a specially designed audio format lasting around 15 minutes. And right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/typology to start your free 7-day trial and get 25% off of a Blinkist Premium membership. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/TYPOLOGY to get 25% off and a 7-day free trial. Blinkist.com/typology.
I think sometimes nines have a lot of stamina, especially when they can bring their energy back in, because nines have a lot of energy, but what happens is they disperse it outside themselves. So I wouldn't say it's a matter of stamina, at least not in my understanding. I would say it's more that incapacity to, or even reminding themselves that it's a good thing to do to access a deeper part of their experience. It's like they're hanging out, like you said, I like the status quo and equilibrium, but it's also a protection. It's a protection against having to show up in life.
Yes.
More undefended and more in terms of letting the flow of life surprise them. You know, it's like like I'm going to protect myself in comfort. For the self-preservation nine, it's like when they start to grow, comfort is the enemy. But when they're protecting themselves and doing their things in personality, protection and comfort is where they hang out.
Well, I think you're into the growth path, which is great, which is right action. There's a Buddhist term, by the way. We could explore that. But right action, in my experience for nines, and this is where growth can start for them, oftentimes life, if a nine sometimes doesn't let life get to them, sometimes life will not agree. You know, like some crisis will emerge where they have to move. They have to act. They just have to act. Maybe it's a child comes down with a chronic illness, or there's a divorce, or whatever it may be. Some crisis hits that they wake up, and right action kicks into gear, right? And if they're doing their work, they can amp up to it, or sometimes life just drops a piano from a 5th-story window on top of them, right? And there's this sort of waking up moment. And though it's, no one wishes ill on anybody or crisis on anybody, a lot of nines I know who have woken up will say, yeah, it was painful, but in some ways the best thing that ever happened to me, because I woke up. I came to consciousness as a result. Why don't you talk a little bit more about right action?
So we sometimes say that sloth is all the actions except the right one. And right action is like the heart's knowing of exactly the next thing that needs to happen,
right? And
an unstoppable willingness or force of doing that one thing that's going to help themselves, help the world, initiate a new action, a new change in the world. And it's almost like when a 9 gets in that zone, it's like it's so clear what they need to do for themselves, and they can't not do it. And so it's beautiful to see 9s wake up exactly like you say in that way, and know and go from like not knowing what they want and feeling how frustrating that is, to going to know exactly what the next thing is that they need to do.
Yeah. This is, my wife's a 1-to-1 9, but I've seen this dynamic in her own life, where there's this awakening moment where life, you can go through life for a long time, maybe without letting it get to you. But then sometimes life goes, sorry, it's like you are either going to have to rise to this moment and show up or not. But the consequences of not showing up will be greater than the discomfort of doing the work, and that can be really pretty great for a 9, albeit I don't wish them crises, but sometimes that's the way forward. Okay, let's talk about social 9s.
So social 9s.
Yep.
Social 9s are the counter type of the 3 9s, and the counter type, of course, is the type that kind of doesn't look like you think it would, especially when it comes to the passion. But they still, of course, have sloth. It's just that they're really, really busy. They work really, really hard. Right. They're the second biggest workaholics on the Enneagram after 3s. And they focus on the group or on service, serving the group in some way, as a way of erasing themselves or not focusing on themselves. It's like distracting themselves by what needs to be done for others or the community or the family, such that they don't tune into themselves. And underneath that is a strong desire to belong. Social 9s have a kind of deep sadness about not belonging. And so it's like, I'm working hard to earn my membership, but of course, they never, at the level of personality, we never get what we're going for. And so It's like, no matter how hard they work, they don't feel like they belong.
Yes. And this is the type where if you think of the self-pres 9 as merging or fusing with physical needs or of the body, right? This is now we're starting to see with the social 9 and the 1-to-1 9, the fusing with another or with a group. In other words, fusing with the agenda of the group, the expectations of the group, the needs of the group, while to the detriment or to the exclusion of one's own, right? It's forgetting one's own and then merging with that of the group. And you're right; these folks can work like crazy on behalf of the group, and in order to, I would say, probably in part to maintain union with it. Does that sound fair? Or?
Yeah, I would say trying to be one with, to feel included, to feel like they belong. And yet the irony is that no matter how hard they work, they often don't achieve that sense of belonging, which only makes them and of course, for all of the subtypes, there's kind of a vicious circle of a driving need, and that need never gets met. So it drives you around in circles. But yes, a drive to belong. And so that motivates really, really hard work, doing whatever it takes. And it could be in the family, like mediating disputes, or, bringing things to the group that they think people need that will help them. But often not putting themselves in the picture.
Yeah, that's why I think these are, again, people stereotype 9s and as they do with all types. And when I'm doing corporate work, a lot of times I'll have people say, I just don't think of like 4s and 9s as being leaders. And I'm like, oh, be careful. 9s can make great leaders because of their supportiveness, their meeting needs of the group, but even more so, they're consensus leaders. They're so inclusive. They really want to hear from everybody. They want to bring everybody around the table. I think you could argue, and you might disagree with me, but I just think about, regardless of where political stances fall, some of our best presidents have been 9s. They're deal makers. They're kind of easy, more easygoing, less combative, less, all that stuff. And I'm sure you've seen that in your corporate work as well. I mean, gosh, great team leaders. But do you think that's part of the reason they get nailed as 2s sometimes?
I do think that 9s make great leaders, and social 9s, I actually think, end up being leaders quite a lot, and they often get drafted into it by others who notice. And in addition to everything you said about why they make great leaders, is I think they have a natural humility. I think there's a way that they aren't doing it for their own self-aggrandizement. They aren't doing it they don't have big egos. So I think that's a big reason that 9s make good leaders, and when they do become leaders, why they are really excellent leaders.
It's interesting you should say that, because I do think that's a difference with 2s.
Yeah.
I mean, 2s can be much more strategic and ambitious.
Yes.
Than a 9. Now, that doesn't mean a 2 can be a leader, but a 9 in an entirely different way because of that humility piece that the 2 struggles to get. That's the virtue that the 2 has to move toward, but it's not something the 9 has to move toward. They kind of have. In fact, what I would say is that if there are certain types that I would say tend to fall on the higher end of the narcissism scale. I often say that 9s don't have enough narcissism. They tend to fall too low on the scale. And I'm oftentimes telling them, you could afford to be a little more narcissistic, and I as a 4 could afford to be a little less narcissistic,
Hey, Typology Tribe. I want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for helping us bring you what I hope is great content every week. Now, you all know I'm a big proponent of counseling. Whether you feel like something is interfering with your happiness or preventing you from achieving certain goals, counseling is a great tool to help identify what those blocks are and then work through them. Yet finding a therapist can sometimes feel intimidating, but not with BetterHelp. BetterHelp offers online counseling at your own time and your own pace. You can schedule secure video or phone sessions plus text and chat with your therapist when it's convenient for you. These are licensed professional counselors who specialize in things like depression, anxiety, stress, relationships, LGBT matters, trauma, and grief. BetterHelp has counselors available worldwide and have over 3,000 U.S. licensed therapists across all 50 states. In fact, so many people have been using BetterHelp that they are recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states. And get this, if you're not satisfied with your counselor for any reason, you can request a new one at any time at no additional cost. Best of all, it's a truly affordable option. I want you to start living a happier life today. As a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting betterhelp.com/typologypodcast. Join over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health. Again, that's BetterHelp, HELP.com/typologypodcast. TYPOLOGYPODCAST.
What's the transformational path for this subtype?
For the social 9, it's about exactly like you're saying, doing things more to allow themselves to be recognized, taking credit for things, putting themselves in the picture, recognizing all the ways they do belong, taking in the positive feedback that other people give them when they do so much, so that they don't kind of keep getting motivated and not filled up by the positive things that they do and the impact that they have. Tuning in more to themselves, getting in more in touch with sadness, allowing themselves to really feel that. And of course, getting in touch with anger is always really important for 9s as well.
Great. Well said. Let's move on to sexual 9s.
Okay.
1-to-1 9s. This is my wife, Anne. I think this is, I've heard people say that 9s are the sweethearts of the Enneagram. That's a phrase I've heard before in Enneagram circles. And I think of all of them, the sexual 9, the 1-to-1 9 is really a sweetheart.
Yes.
Really a sweetheart. They are less assertive. They're very gentle, right? And their presence is so inviting and kind. I do think that these folks, if the social 9 fuses with the agenda of the group, the 1-to-1 9 tends to fuse or merge with the life of another individual, right? Or perhaps a small number of individuals, or you wouldn't quite call it a group, because it's so small. But this is the type that I think sometimes so depends on merging with the life agenda of the other and supporting it, and then confusing the success of the other with their own, right? That they get into trouble because their identity is gleaned I think, a sense of identity and a filling of the void is gotten through the fusion with another person. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's almost a sense of having no boundaries between you and another person. And it's usually, the important people in the Nine's life that they really merge with it a deeper level, to the point where they don't maybe realize that they've taken on the opinions, the feelings of that other person so completely. Sometimes if they do register their own opinions or feelings, if they go against what that special person thinks or feels, they'll kind of keep it to themselves. And it's a sense of not being able to separate. I've heard a lot of stories of sexual nines who were in bad relationships that they couldn't get out of.
Yes.
Or it took them a very long time to get out of. I even heard one guy say that he, a couple of times, had moved to a different city without telling his partner until he was already gone. Because it's so hard to separate.
Or they get divorced, but to live in separate bedrooms in the same house.
Yes. Or stay connected. Like, I'm still taking care of my partner. We're still like really, really connected, even though we're separated or divorced.
Right. Man, so fascinating, right?
Totally.
And I do think that at midlife, sometimes 1-to-1 nines have this sort of moment where they go, wait a minute. What about my voice? Like, what is my voice? Right. And I've got to find it. And it's, again, one of those moments that I think is so great for the nine. And of course, knowing the Enneagram means that when you're younger, you can begin this journey. You don't have to wait until you're 48 to wake up and go, I've spent my whole life kind of merged with the agendas of my children and my wife or my husband and, just sort of following around. I've got to find my own path. Right. That's their midlife crisis agenda, isn't it?
Yeah. Finding their own sense of purpose. And maybe they're really good at something, or they have a career, but they haven't fully manifested it because it's been hard for them to really invest in, focus on their own independent path or a sense of mission in the world.
So nines wrestle with anger, right? Or they have issues around anger. How does the sexual nine express their anger?
Sometimes the sexual nine, even more than the other two nines, has no awareness of their own anger. Especially as we're talking about, it's threatening to separate from that person you've fused with and that you don't feel any sense of boundary with. And so it makes it, there's a lot of disincentives for registering anger or feeling it and certainly expressing it. So sometimes I've found it can be hardest for the sexual nine to get in touch with their anger.
Yes. I had a 9 and an 8 in therapy once, and I said, which one of you has more power in this relationship? And the 8 looked at the 9, and you wouldn't think it. He goes, it's like I'm an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. And there's that anger being expressed passive aggressively. The 8 wants it to come right out, and the 9, you think they're capitulating sometimes, but nope, they're actually passive aggressively, and that's why they feel like an immovable object sometimes when they're angry. Yeah, they don't say it straight out, but it's being expressed very subtly and effectively.
Yeah, it's the power of the mountain. It's the passive resistance, or as my self-preservation 9 friend says, it's like, who wins the battle, the tank or the swamp?
Well, there's that 9-8 dynamic, isn't it? Right there. And I think that gets expressed across the board regardless of type. All right. You say in your book, and I found it fascinating, that sometimes the 1-to-1 9 can get pegged as a 4.
Yeah.
All right. Unpack that for folks.
Yeah. I have a good friend who's a 1-to-1 9, and she periodically asks me, are you sure I'm not a 4? And I think part of it is a sensitivity to the push-pull of relationship. There's so much attention on the other And it can feel like introjection of the 4, which is the taking in from the outside in order to control it, but as opposed to the merging. And I also think they're the most emotional of the 3 nines. Now, I've seen sexual 9s who appear quite emotional, but it's a kind of instinctual energy. It's not pure heart energy, but it can feel that way, a little bit like I'm more sensitive, I'm more emotional, and I'm more tuned into relationship. And so they can look a little bit like a heart type. And again, not wanting to have the other go. It can feel like a little bit of like the fear of abandonment of the 4.
My wife has an insight about 9s that I think is interesting. I'd love to get your thoughts about it. My wife says that one of the things that she's experienced as a 9 across the board with 9s as well is this belief in unconditional love. That there should be a receiving of they anticipate that in return for their way of being in the world and in that relationship, that unconditional love should be what comes back to them, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember one time saying to my wife in a heated moment, unconditional love is a little bit of a myth, I mean, it's something that we want to aspire toward, but there is a breaking point in every relationship. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think the 9 wants to hear that there is this unconditional love that will never lead to disconnection, that will never lead to separation or abandonment. And it's like, yeah, but you have to show up. You got to show up and bring juice to the relationship. And if you don't, you can't expect love to always just, like one of the things that Annie used to say, and by the way, I'm not saying anything that she hasn't said in public, things that I've done before. So it's not like I'm, airing dirty laundry here. And she's done so much growth that this is, part of her journey, but not at present. That somehow or another in the relationship that, you eventually either bring yourself to it and become your own self, or the other person has no one to be in relationship to. And that eventually will, begin to make unconditional love difficult, right?
Exactly. Or impossible. I think you're absolutely right that I think sexual 9s can mistake this kind of fusion for unconditional love. And I also think that sexual 9s tend to erase themselves from the equation such that 1 + 1 = 1. Because they're not standing in their own shoes. And a relationship, and especially a relationship that leads to unconditional love, is a relationship between 2 people that each are kind of rooted in their own self, but then come together. And I think what sexual 9s can do is they take themselves out. And so, like you're saying, they're not home to receive that. They've just merged completely with the other person. So it can seem like a kind of closeness or love, but it actually isn't, because that person isn't putting themselves fully in the picture.
Right. And so this, I think, is part of their transformational path. I mean, I'm not sure if I said this in the road back to you or somewhere else, but I like to think that true union with another human being in love, right, is you have 2 separate candles and 1 flame. So it's like you hold 2 candles in a wick to wick that are lit. And so union is in the flame, but it requires 2 candles.
Right.
2 separate beings. And the paradox in relationship is, I think, that the more separate and defined 2 people are, the healthier and the more exciting the relationship. And the more merged and fused you are, the more boring and predictable the relationship becomes.
Exactly. When I was doing more couples counseling, what I actually found was that couples who had conflict and, healthy conflict, constructive conflict, had a better relationship than the couples who never had conflict, because they would eventually kind of get disengaged.
Yes.
There was a lack of juice in the relationship that's about 2 different people doing the kind of hard work to kind of come together. And there's a lot of juice. And as Esther Perel says it, having a bridge to cross, having a gap to overcome. That's part of what makes relationships exciting and healthy and juicy.
And that is a great place to end. We just sort of laid out the growth path for nines. B, this has been so great. We have done 1s, 2s, 6s, and 9s. And now, if you will indulge me, can we please do 3, 4s, 5s, 7s, and 8s? Because this has been so fun.
Yes. I love talking to you 4s. I always love having a conversation with you about the Enneagram. I love what you've brought to this. And I would love to do that.
Good. Beatrice Chestnut, author of The Complete Enneagram, 27 Paths to Greater Self-Knowledge. Tell everybody where they can learn more about you.
cpenneagram.com and beatricechestnut.com.
Wonderful. B, we love you. And we hope we're going to get you back to cover those other numbers. And to you, my friends, Typology family, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace, may you have healing, may you have rest. Until next time.